If you don't know, the Center for Global Affairs this year celebrated its 10-year anniversary. And whether through its graduate or non-degree programs, its mission is to prepare global leaders to identify and form solutions to today's most pressing challenges and to create a community for those committed to this work. I expect that most of you know our host for tonight's conversation. Professor Alon Ben Meir plays an important role at the Center for Global Affairs. He teaches a course on the Middle East. He taught graduate courses in international relations and negotiations. He writes and appears in a variety of news media, including my favorite appearance at The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He brings an impressive scholarly background, professional experience, and a true passion for furthering diplomacy and peaceful negotiations in a region that sorely needs it. Because of his credentials and connections, he is able to attract a truly impressive array of speakers, including tonight's distinguished guest. I personally have learned a great deal from Professor Ben Meir from both his negotiations class and the adventures we took together to the Middle East, and I'm certainly grateful to him. His guest tonight is Dr. Najib Ghadbian. Dr. Ghadbian is a Syrian pro-democracy activist and academic. He served on the board of the Day After Project, a cooperative movement by members of the Syrian opposition to outline a plan to rebuild the country and end the Syrian conflict once Bashar al-Assad is ousted from power. An associate professor of political science and the Middle East studies at the University of Arkansas, he is an author of 2 books and contributed political commentaries to several US, European, and Middle East media outlets. He served as a founding member of the Democratic Network in the Arab world and a founding member of the Syrian National Council. So we welcome Dr. Ghadbian tonight. Professor?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much. You're very generous with your introduction, and thank you for being here today with us. You know, before I start with the first question, I just wanted to know that having myself been involved in Syrian affairs going back so many years, and as I witnessed the unfolding tragedy, sometimes I feel a terrible loss. Will it ever come to an end? Will it ever come to end this horrible misery and pain that has been inflicted on the Syrian people? So I want to first of all extend to you my sympathy and my concern. And I hope the sooner than later we'll see an end to this carnage that's taking place today in Syria without Bashar al-Assad being in power. You know, one of the things that has been troubling the supporters specifically of the rebel movement is that the fact that the rebelliousness, the rebels themselves, have never been able to speak in one voice, to unite in a manner so that they can actually represent the people, the fighters on the ground, and to represent also the various sects within Syria itself. What do you see this is going? Because this has been one of the main impediments. For example, the United States is saying we would like to support the rebels, but who do we support? You know, they don't have a specific address to go to. What it is that you think can be done to rectify this first and foremost, which seemed to be central, to bring in some kind of a conclusion to this conflict?
Let me begin first, Alon, by thanking you for inviting me, for the center, for everybody coming this evening to listen to Syria. I think it's one of the most important political issues facing us, in fact, in this country and maybe in the whole region and in the world. The question of the lack of unity of the so-called opposition has been, in fact, with us since the beginning of this revolution. I always like to give a background about this, and that is, you know, as you know, Alon, for a long time, Syrians were not allowed to be active in politics. They were not allowed to be active, interested in public affairs. My favorite story of this group of young activists in 2003, they were watching the satellite TV and watching activism in all of the countries. And they said, we need to do something non-political, it's an act of civil society. So, and the town they came from was Daraya. It's in the suburb of Damascus. So they came up with an idea. Let's go and clean the street of Darya. They were arrested the next day. They were told, are you telling a message that the state is not doing its job by cleaning the street? That's a political act. This, I think, I give this background to tell you how difficult it was for Syrians to come together, to work collectively. Many of the activists that, in fact, were leading prominent political figures who were, of course, subjected to imprisonment. Many of us were forced into exiles. Others were, in fact, even tortured and killed in prisons. They came out mistrusting each other so much because the regime was so clever in creating that type of mistrust among the activists inside Syria. Again, this is a background to what happened. We were talking early on.
But then again, I fully understand this, and obviously I appreciate that. But that has changed.
Right.
That is, now you have rebelliousness. Now the objective, at least on the surface, is all of them, regardless of their political leanings and coloration, they want to oust Bashar Assad.
That's right.
So you would think that since there is a common goal, they will develop a strategy. So they work together in order to achieve that common goal. Why is it after 3 years of slaughter, they have not come to this basic conclusion? Worse than that, they're actually fighting each other. They're killing each other instead of working in unison toward a single goal that has been so important to them from day one.
Okay, I was actually going to come to that point. The process of building a viable oppositional movement went through phases. The first phase was for a lot of Syrians from inside and outside to try to gather and discuss things. Then the second phase was the phase of forming the Syrian National Council, the predecessor to the coalition. And it was really a long and hard process. As you said, Syria is a diverse country of different sects, different religious backgrounds, different political orientations, and again, with the background I mentioned of the lack of really maybe political skills to create that type of coalition. So it took a long time to do that. That's at the political level. But I think finally we got it. I mean, we have today the National Coalition is made up of 121. It does represent most communities in Syria, Muslim, Christians, Kurds, Arabs, Alawites, Druze, every group, and the different political orientations. And I think the strength of this latest formation, the coalition, from the previous one, is to try to bridge the gap between the inside and the outside. So one of the most important representatives of the coalition are what we call local councils in the 14 provinces of Syria. And those kind of councils vary in their level of outreach to their communities. But in some cases, for instance, in the rural Damascus, which is a major district and governorate in Syria, Rif Dimashq, they had, for the first time, election under the bombardment of the Assad, under the sanctions, under the siege, under all of the brutality of the Assad regime. They were able to elect a local council of about 200 representing this whole governorate. And of course, we had the same in Aleppo. The point is, we are very, very cognizant of the fact that we need to create that viable alternative to the Assad regime that represent the various communities. Now, I think we reached a certain minimum degree of acceptance worldwide, and we are recognized by so many countries, 114 countries.
But recognition is one thing.
That's right.
The fact remains, when I speak to representative officials from the United States government, they still tell me today, listen, we do not know who to help. Who should we, for example, they're discussing.
Now we're talking at the military level, which I'm going to talk about.
Military level is very, very important. That is, look, Assad has been gaining a great deal of ground in the last 6 months in particular. And when you ask anyone who's been supporting the rebels, be that Saudis, Bahrainis, Qataris, and others, well, they are funneling weapons, aid, supplies to them, but not the kind of weapon that could make a difference on the ground. And the only country that has this kind of weapon, or permit other countries like Saudi Arabia and others to give the Syrian rebel this type, for example, the shoulder fire, anti-aircraft missiles. Well, this is one single weapon that could make a huge difference by downing the airplanes flying at low altitude, by downing helicopters, which are causing havoc. But here you have a government here in the United States is unwilling at this point because they say, we cannot vet, we do not know who to give it to, fearing that it's going to fall in the wrong hands, which means notwithstanding what you are saying, and perhaps there is some progress in terms of getting some unified approach, but they still haven't convinced the international community, specifically the United States, more than any other country, that something need to be, you have to be more demonstrative. You have to demonstrate, really, that you, in fact, you have such a group, and the United States cannot trust A, B, C to give them the kind of weapon and guarantee that they will not fall in the wrong hand. That has not occurred to this very moment. What do we do?
Okay. You're raising a lot of points, and I must address them, very important. The Free Syrian Army, something came out without really planning. Many of us were not in favor of the militarization of the revolution. When this revolution began, it was a continuation of the Arab Spring. Many of us thought it would be clean, like the Cairo demonstrations, the Tunisian example. We never thought it would last this long. And we were talking early on how in the first 6 months to 7 months, it was peaceful for the most part. And I think people really, really try to avoid being, provoked into a military confrontation, because we knew the brutality of the regime, we know the history, the willingness of the regime to go to the extreme. But finally, people had enough. So we had the defectors from the military, and then we had civilians who turned and decided to carry, to carry out weapons in self-defense in most cases. That process was so localized. For instance, in this city, it was different from the other cities. And in fact, the fact that it was fragmented early on prevented the government from being able to defeat it. Because if it were all centralized, it would be much easier for the Assad army, which is, again, this regime is basically is an example of what we call the mukhabarat state. It's based on the security forces. It's based on the armed forces. That's all what they do. They're over, militarized. So the process of the creation of the Free Syrian Army was, again, something spontaneous. And finally, we got some help from the friendly countries, the Friends of Syria. And the Friends of Syria is a group of countries which was, in fact, created because of the failure of the Security Council to take decisive action. I want to give you an example of how the paralysis of the international community contributed into the crimes of Assad and into the dysfunctional situation we have in Syria. If you remember in Libya, when the Libyan people revolted against Gaddafi, it was in the first 3 weeks. There were Security Council resolutions condemning the crackdown of the Gaddafi. It was sooner. You had the GCC, the Arab League, the Security Councils taking measures, including a UN Security Council resolution 1973 to allow the protection of civilians and the no-fly zone in Libya. A lot of Syrians, when the crackdown happened in Syria, they thought the same thing could be forthcoming. They were mistaken. Unfortunately, one of the factors that worked against us was Russia this time. Russia vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions regarding Syria, starting in 2011, November, February, and March. And they all called for political solution. They all called for a process that could, in fact, the last one, to empower observers, which were sent by the UN itself. So the situation in Syria, regionally, internationally, was different from the other
Well,
countries.
it is different and continue to be different. Can you, for example, expect Russia to change its position now, specifically because what's happening in Crimea? Obviously, the last thing they want to do is cooperate with the United States to resolve the question, the problem in Syria. Can you really count on Iran to cease and desist from supporting the Assad regime? That is not going to happen. What do you do with the various, they have 30, 40 different jihadi groups who are not working with the coalition? What do you do with the Jabhat al-Nusra? What do you do with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria? These are powerful groups, specifically the last two.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as you have this factionalism within the coalition, this is going to be extreme. I mean, as far as I can see, there is not a solution that we can envision here what's going to happen. So let me move to that. What is going to take? Okay. What is going to take to change the dynamics on the ground? That's what matters to us the most. We don't want to sit here in a year from now or two and we're still talking about the carnage that's taking place in Syria. What can we do, realistically speaking, from your perspective? How can we change the dynamics on the ground in order to end this horror from continuing?
I need to, again, go back, and sorry I'm giving a lot of background here, but I feel it's important. And I know you want to press me on that difficult questions, but I'll handle both.
Pressing you, no, but honestly, I like, because, we would like to look ahead.
Sure.
We know the problems, and you have articulated that, background of the rebels, the reason why they could not organize themselves early. We know the story about the Syrian Free Army, but I'd like to look forward now, ahead. What do we do now?
Okay.
What is going to take?
I just want to say that after the formation of the coalition, we formed a military structure called the SMC, Supreme Military Command, which is basically the moderate forces trying to bring them together under one umbrella to create command and structure. At that time, there was a beginning of a Nusra. At certain point, the lack of support from key countries, including the regional countries and the international community, for the Free Syrian Army, which in fact, had it been coming, we would have avoided a lot of the problems. I remind you, a year and a half ago, there was no Jabhat al-Nusra and there was no ISIS in Syria. These groups came to fill in the vacuum which was left by the fact that the moderate forces were not supported enough. This is a fact. And
I agree with you.
And we need to in fact, name who's responsible for that.
No, but then again.
But now I'll come to right now.
Let me just say the following. This is true. Had the United States or the Arab League, if there's such a thing, could interfere earlier, 2 or 3, 4, 5 months after the eruption of the first initial violence, things would have been different today.
Right.
But that did not happen. And it's gotten worse ever since. So that is why I'm more concerned about what do we do now.
Okay.
So the background, I accept that, and I really appreciate
Now I'll
that.
talk about
Yes.
what should we do.
Yes.
Now we have a political umbrella called the coalition. It's, I would claim that it's representative of most communities in Syria. Again, it's a political organization with a vision of a free and democratic Syria. It's an organization that's committed to a political solution and showed, in fact, it can articulate a vision and accepted a Geneva process, which was, in fact, orchestrated by the US and Russia. And we participated in the process. We showed that we were responsible. We went there with practical solution, with a roadmap for transition, and it was the other side that did not accept it. So I think you cannot question the viability of this political organization anymore. A lot of countries, as I said, 114 countries recognize this political coalition
be that as it may.
So that's a political address now.
But be that as it may.
Okay.
You're talking
I will
about
come
Geneva
to
II. Let me just go
yes.
back to Geneva II. I, like score of many others, suggested from a month before it took place, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before it took place, we said, this Geneva II will not produce anything whatsoever. And the reason is that you have various players, Russia, United States, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. They have entirely different agenda. And Assad, having been making significant gains in the last 6 months, he's had no reason whatsoever to come to the negotiating table and make any kind of concession. That was a given. So this was a play that basically Russia engineered all of this, and I absolutely believe that, knowing full well that nothing is going to come out of this. So now they're talking about Geneva III. I think it's ridiculous. It's cynical. Nothing is going to come out of this. So you need to think out of the box. What do we do? That is, going back to Geneva II, when you talk about political solution, what kind of political solution? Would that include Bashar Assad? And if it does not include Bashar Assad, do you really think that the representative of the Syrian government are going to sit down and negotiate, knowing that Assad cannot be part of the solution?
Having said all of that, and I don't disagree with your assessment, I think it was important to pursue that process. As I said, we could blame so many countries for not standing up to their responsibilities. As I said, the Security Council was paralyzed because of Russia and China 3 times. And the Friends of Syria, that group of countries, 114 countries, which basically supported the right of the Syrian people to choose their leaders and for, embrace the vision of the coalition. They have not provided the necessary support politically, militarily, and economically, while the regime has 3.5 countries supporting it and doing more than these 114 countries combined. So you have Russia, Iran, the Maliki government, and Hezbollah are committing resources, sending fighters, increasing their supply of weapons to the regime, while we, by our best friends, whether in the region, our Arab friends, or regional friends, or the United States and European countries, have not done the same. So I think, again, this is the lack of balance. This is why you're right. I mean, going to a political process in which we have friends like the friends we had, and the regime going with the type of support they got, it's not going to produce a result. This is why the only way for a political solution, it must be enforced political solution, which would require change on the ground. And we could talk about that.
Okay, well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What kind of change? And we can talk about what is the change? Who's going to precipitate that change? So let's try to talk about it in real terms.
Okay.
What is going to, that is, we need to change, and we've said this in this, many times, Assad calculus, that he has to come to the conclusion that he cannot win this war.
Right.
Now, how do you bring about that conclusion? What are we going to have to do to force Assad to think in those terms rather than thinking I'm gaining? And right now, when I talk to some people, they tell me that he, his cohorts, all of them absolutely believe that they will win it, and that the international community will be unable to change, to do anything about it. That's what they believe today. So you need to change the dynamic, you need to change his thinking. What is going to take?
Okay, I will first take an issue with the fact that he's winning. I think the regime has made advances, military advances on the ground, there's no doubt about it. But we should not exaggerate those advances. Today, if you look at the map of Syria, the regime does not control more than 1/3 of the territories of Syria. That's a reality. Now, there are a lot of areas not controlled by the opposition either. It's contested areas. The second factor behind the advances the regime made was the heavy involvement of Hezbollah, Iranian volunteers, Iraqi volunteers on the side of the regime. That's really started to change the tide militarily. Thirdly, we have not received the necessary weapons to defend ourselves. The regime has superiority in the air. And for a long time, there were so many ideas to change this dynamics. Syrians called for no-fly zone. That was not forthcoming. The latest thing we are asking for is strategic weaponry for the moderate forces in Syria, which, by the way, they are still the majority of the fighters of the Free Syrian Army, whether they are secular or moderate Islamists. Now, we have two groups which are problematic. ISIS, which is in fact attacking the Free Syrian Army. That's why starting 3-4 months ago, we are fighting on two fronts. We are fighting the regime and we are fighting ISIS. And then you have al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is more complex and it's actually localized. In some areas, it has the vision of Al-Qaeda, which is problematic to us, but in other areas, it's actually made up of young Syrians who turned to this group at a time when no one was giving them food or money or weapons to fight. So I think what's really could change the situation is two things. Number one, change on the ground, and specifically, we need strategic weaponry for the Free Syrian Army, the vetted army, the army that the U.S. and the Gulf countries and the allies are training, okay, and they are in large numbers to strengthen the command and structure of this group. So it's required anti-tank, anti-aircraft. If you don't trust these factors, if you don't trust this Free Syria, do it yourself. There are ways. One of the problems we've been having since Geneva is the barrel bombing, which is a crime against humanity. You see it every day. Today, they attacked a market in Atarib, which is one of the suburbs of Aleppo, killing 27 people who were shopping during the time of shopping of the day. I mean, they're punishing these liberated areas for basically turning against Assad. Under that situation, if you don't change the military balance on the ground, there won't be any.
And I agree with you, 100%. When you speak today to American officials, they'll still tell you, we cannot be sure that these weapons will not fall in the wrong hands. As a matter of fact, the Joint Chief said today this will be a nightmare. If one single missile falls into the wrong hand, it could create an international incident of such magnitude. Just one civilian airplane could be down, and then you're going to have to deal with something far more complex than you can possibly imagine. So let us suppose you're sitting with the president or with the secretary of state, with the defense minister here, and you say to him, you are considering giving us some weapon. How do you convince him that these weapons will not fall into the wrong hands? What would you say? Now he's speaking about if they don't want to give it to us, let them come. Well, the United States does not want to send boots, they're not soldiers to send.
And we don't want them either.
And you don't want them. And here you have even the Arab states, led by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, those who are actually supporting it. And I ask them, why don't you send? After all, they're part of the Arab League. You're supposed to take care of each other. But they've been sitting on their hands. Yes, they've been supplying, but not enough. Another kind of weapon that you need. And we know that. But the Saudis are not doing anything about it, the Qatar, because they need permission from the United States to give these kind of weapons, because they have it. They have it in their territory. Yeah, they have it. So now try to convince the defense minister here. Well, you can do so by doing A, B, C, or D. What are your A, B, C, and D going to be?
Well, my first one would be what's required of this administration is leadership on Syria, which has been lacking. And I'm talking about political, diplomatic, and military leadership. And I think sometimes the debate here is actually presented as, when we talk about military support, we are talking about boots on the ground. That's not been the case. It will never be the case. That's not needed.
Who would be firing these rockets, these missiles against airplanes?
It will be professional soldiers and officers who defected. Some of them have been trained by the Jordanian, the Saudi, the Americans, and what we're saying, that covered program.
So are you saying that the United States actually is saying this only because they don't want to provide these weapons? They're using the excuse that they might fall into the wrong hands? Is that what you're saying?
I see lack of political will to do something serious
Well,
about
would that
Syria.
be the case? It is not in the interest of the United States.
It is in the interest of the United States, and that's the argument.
Wait a second. I don't think it's in the interest of the United States to see Syria completely unraveled.
Right.
Completely. And Syria is disintegrating. This is going to have major reverberation throughout the Middle East, in one form or another. It's going to have effect on Jordan, on certainly Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, Israel in the longer term. Certainly make the situation in Iraq is even worse. And the Iranian will be sitting and watching, having a nice time, because it's exactly what they want to see happen. Their ambition is to continue this because they want to continue to dominate that region. And the best way to make sure everybody else, that the Sunni are killing each other. That's what they want to see happen. This is exactly what happened. Which means the conflict now transcends really civil war in Syria. It's becoming more regional.
It is a regional conflict.
And it's going to be even more so because it's Shiite versus Sunnis. And it's basically what you see in Iraq is taking now place in Syria as well. So this is no longer just Syrian killing Syrians, but you have outsiders from Iraq, from elsewhere, and now it's transforming. This can become a war between the Sunni and the Shiite. One is pushed by the Iranians to support the Shiite, and the Saudis are supporting the Sunnis. And both have major critical interest in the region, because for them it's becoming almost do or die. Neither government can afford to lose this war.
Yes, I agree with the assessment that, in fact, I would say there are three layers to this conflict now. There is the Syrian one, and that's, not simplistic. It's not the regime versus the opposition. We have the extremists coming in now. Then you have the regional level, and the regional level is basically between Iran and Saudi Arabia to some extent, with, simplifying again. And then U.S., Russia.
Russia, that's right.
I think the problem we have, as I said, is that the regional side and the international side, you have more support of the regime than you have of the people who are fighting and wanting change in Syria.
Absolutely true, yes.
And I think that unless you change that, you're not going to bring the other side into some kind of a political solution.
How do you change it?
As I said, there are two ways. Number one, militarily on the ground, give strategic weaponry to the Free Syrian Army. Increase the training. We asked the U.S. to take direct, control of the training process. There are so many ways, intelligence sharing. I mean, you know, if you have the political will, there are so many creative ideas to really, again, basically change the
But then
balance
you
of power.
alluded just a minute ago that
Yeah.
the United States actually would like to see this conflict continue. There's something you implied that, if you didn't say it
Well,
outright.
you know,
That the United States doesn't have a real interest to containing or ending this conflict. Did you
I
just
mean,
say that?
you know, I want to take the words of the administration, take them by their words. I don't want to read beyond that. And from the first month of this conflict, President Obama basically endorsed the protest movement, and he said, Assad must go. I think people expected a lot of the U.S. That was not forthcoming. And as we said, even when there were countries that were willing to provide more support militarily, it was the administration that vetoed this kind of support. We know that within the administration at one point, you have the Pentagon, the State Department, CIA, all advising the president to provide more support for the Free Syrian Army. And it was actually overturned by the president. I mean, that's...
This is true. That was in the previous term.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
that Hillary
hasn't,
and Gates and
hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
But I think what I can do, go back to your previous question, if I were to make the case for U.S. leadership, I would say we reach a point in the conflict where it's going to affect all of the countries in the region. Now, take just the refugees. We just passed the mark of 1 million refugees in Lebanon. That's almost 1/4 of the Lebanese population. We almost passed the 1 million mark in Jordan. We are about 900,000 in Turkey, and the same for the whole region. So I know the administration would not allow this conflict to destabilize the whole region, and that I think is in the national interest of the U.S. In the national interest of the U.S. to weaken this axis of the Iran, Hezbollah, radical axis, and I think we are fighting that axis. So on both, actually, the national interest point of view and the U.S. values, the U.S. really should be more involved in supporting the right side of this. Finally, it's not just a U.S. unilateral operation. There are so many countries willing to do more, but the U.S. should not inhibit these countries from doing what they want to do, including European countries. UK and France are, in fact, more forthcoming to do more. But I think what this group lacks, the Friends of Syria, is a leader. And I think that's been our problem.
I happen to agree with you 100%. I've been saying all along, the United States, specifically President Obama, has been aloof, for, naive for that matter, thinking that without American leadership, the power equation on the ground, the situation with Al-Sharas is going to change. That is not going to change, and I absolutely agree. Leadership here matters, not just any leadership, but from the United States in particular.
And from the White House.
The White House, absolutely. I mean, without that kind of involvement, direct involvement, not necessarily sending troops, but again, like you have just articulated, and I think you said in that regard is absolutely correct. But now we are still watching, and the United States still hesitant. The White House still hasn't made a decision. They're talking about the possibilities. The army, the military is still against it. They're advising him not to provide these kind of... President Obama, who vacillates quite a bit, and he's not as decisive as we would like to have a president here. He's listening to these guys, and he may still not do much about it. And where do we go from here?
Okay, I think there another maybe element that we haven't really talked about, and that is the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria. I think if you look at the numbers now, we have close to 11 million Syrians, almost half the population, are either internally displaced or made up into refugees. We have about 3.5 million, these are UN figures, who are besieged and lack any access to basic food and medicine. We have about 300,000 who are facing starvation, and we've seen cases of death in today's Syria because of the lack of basic either food or medicine. I think that's creating a humanitarian catastrophe of the magnitude we haven't seen really, for generations. I don't want to exaggerate here. I think there is an imperative here, not only for the U.S., but for the whole international community to do something about it. And one of the things, in fact, when we went to Geneva, we put as a, kind of a prerequisite for any political solution is to allow humanitarian access. That did not happen. Finally, the Security Council was able to, kind of pass a resolution to 2139, which would require both the regime and the opposition to allow humanitarian access to these areas. I think this can be one of the avenues through which would invite further, in fact, involvement, not only of the US, European countries, the rest of the international community. Because so far we have 2 reports coming from OCHA, other UN organizations, saying the regime has not fulfilled its obligation under this.
True, yes.
And I think we could make a strong case, again, from that point of view, for action. And again, the regime will not do this voluntarily. They're using starvation as a weapon of war. And so there should be consequences. It's one of the sad things of this
Okay,
conflict.
but he's saying that there should be consequences, and I agree with you. But who is going to do that? Who is going to make sure that there will be consequences when, in fact, just in the European community, the Arab League, even the United States are pretty much paralyzed. They're doing very little in order to, again, to change the power structure that is what's going on the ground. Who is going to make that when there is so much reluctance? And I mean, when you talk to officials here in the United States, what do you tell them? I mean, what you are saying is absolutely makes sense. This is what it takes, and I agree with you. I've been preaching this gospel for 3 years now. This is what's going to take. What do you tell them to convince them that time has come, or else this catastrophe is going not just to engulf half of the population, but the whole country will be in ruin.
Right.
Completely in ruin.
Well, we have sympathetic audience, I mean, within the administration. State Department, for instance, a lot of people really are open to what we say. I think we are now lobbying Congress, and I think we've seen voices in Congress who are calling for more action in Syria, and we welcome that. I think we need to address the public opinion. We need to address the American people. And unfortunately, most Americans have not really been paying attention to that. In fact, the administration used public opinions and the apathy that exists and the lack of any, enthusiasm for intervention.
The American public is weary. I mean,
Right.
This is
Right.
what they think. There was the war in Iraq, however misguided, it's terrible it's been. We still continue to fight in Afghanistan. They are tired of sending American troops, albeit you're not asking for that. They are tired of getting involved in any other military confrontation with anyone, specifically not in another Arab country.
Right.
Or Islamic country for that matter. So yes, you have pretty much public apathy, and I think you are absolutely right when you suggest we need to impact public opinion here. What are we doing to do that? Are you taking some steps? I mean, I would love to see these kind of forums take place everywhere in the country, in every single city. And we appear on television day in and day out to educate the American public. We are looking at unfolding a tragedy. 40,000 children under the age of 12 have died in this conflict. I mean, it is, it's incredible to just think in terms of if they stood up and held hands, it will be 30 miles long. That's how horrifying the situation is. And then, we are looking at this happening, and we're still debating what is impossible, what is difficult, instead of thinking what's possible, what can we do. I mean, this is the dilemma we have. Everybody is perfectly providing the reason why not.
Right.
Why cannot do that? Because we cannot, because of A, B, C, and D. But they are not saying what it is that can be done, because this cannot continue. I mean, where is the human conscience? What happened? How can we allow this atrocities to continue unabated, and people are just watching?
I mean, I'm going to just say amen to all what you said. I mean, this is what we've been, in fact, doing to appeal to the U.S. public opinion, to governments, to the world, to the UN. I mean, we do a lot of work within, limited resources. And I think the other, side of this is that, believe me, Syrians themselves are not going to give up. I mean, despite all of the brutality, despite all of the crimes, despite all of the hardship, people are fighting back. And they will continue. And there are a sense of abandonment inside Syria. One of the slogans that's emerged out of the revolution compared to the early one, something like, we have no one with us except Allah, except God. I mean, really, that's how they feel. And that's too bad. Again, this is not to kind of underestimate the support we receive, because really the humanitarian tragedy, as I said, is just beyond the ability of any group or country to be able to address. I mean, the U.S., one of the things, for instance, they always tell us we provided $1.7 billion in humanitarian assistance, and we say thank you, this is wonderful. Other countries have done the same, but you are dealing with one of the consequences of the conflict. You're not addressing the core of the issue, which is a political conflict, and unless you find a solution which must be imposed on a people like Bashar al-Assad and his ally, you are not going to end it.
But how do you impose it when you have Russia is in the middle, which is preventing that, has prevented that in the past, and will continue to do so, even more so today than 2, 3, 4, 5 months ago?
Well, they are
What do you
unfortunately emboldened and empowered by the lack of resolve on the part of countries like the U.S.
That is the problem. So how do you change these dynamics? You look at Iran. Iran has zero interest in doing anything else other than continue to support Assad. This is the problem, and I don't see the United States actually changing in such a dramatic way its approach to this whole thing in order to begin some kind of a process of looking for a political solution, which cannot happen unless, again, Assad come to the conclusion that he cannot win this conflict.
Right. And that's, I think, why we're doing everything. I mentioned, for instance, the necessity of changing the military balance of power on the ground. I think politically, we've been presenting several countries with different options to isolate the regime, to punish the regime. One of the things at the level of the Arab League suspended membership of the regime in the Arab League. They supposed to pass on the seat to the coalition. The regime closed embassies in some Arab countries. We're asking those countries to hand over the embassies to the coalition, so we could start, in fact, to exercise our role as an alternative to the Assad in the liberated area.
But this is all very so marginal. I don't think Bashar al-Assad could care less if these embassies are open or closed.
Believe me, they do have impact.
Well, I mean,
if you take it at a large scale, at the level of the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, at the UN,
only to the extent that he thinks he's going to stay in power, then might matters to him. But who is going to continue to deal with Assad should he prevail? Really?
I don't think Assad will prevail. I assure you of that.
Okay, well, let's see how can we start.
And I get this belief from talking to Syrians on the ground, that those who are struggling on a daily basis to survive and to fight back, they will not let this happen. Unfortunately, it's been too high of a cost already. And that's why I think the international community should make that point. They should make it clear that this is not an acceptable outcome. And I think, again,
But they tolerated civil war in Lebanon for 15 years. 15 years. Right. The country was laid in ruin. 15 years, the Lebanese were killing each other. Why there's going to be any difference now? They're going to look at the Syrians killing each other for another 10 years. Why they were so tolerant of what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in Lebanon, and would be less tolerant what's taking place now in Syria. I mean, we have precedent like this. It is sad. It is so sad. It is so tragic, but it's happening.
It's taking longer than what many of us, in fact, predicted. As I said, there is a lot of political will and a lot of resolve among Syrians, inside Syria, to continue this. Despite, again, all of the limitations, we're trying to provide, for instance, governance to those areas in the liberated areas, to provide, create, organize, local communities, to try to create ways to provide access beyond what the UN can do, for instance. And of course, people are maturing politically, militarily, I think, and it's really with the little help we can get from the friends, so-called friends of Syria, I think you could really create the condition that end the violence and put the country on a path of a transition. We know what it takes, but that's why I think this country matters a lot.
So
And-
they have a sort of a timeline. How long this might take? There are two options. If the United States take the real initiative and do something substantial, that could accelerate the process and perhaps end this conflict sooner than later. But in absence of that, what's your prediction? What's going to happen? What will happen?
We don't like to predict in social sciences. but
we ought
but
to.
we would like to see.
You have to think in terms of future scenario.
Yeah.
Well, these are the possibilities, and you're going to have to choose the lesser of all
Right.
evils. And so you have to consider the possibility that this could continue for another 5, 6, 7 years.
Right.
And you're going to have a plan to try not to allow it to happen that way. And this is what we're talking about.
Mhm. No, I think, in that sense, that's what we're trying to do. We have still worst case scenario. I mean, Syria already kind of really slipped into some, semi-failed state in a way. And we need to stop that process. The second, again, possibility, again, of this becoming a truly regional sectarian conflict, again, is not in the interest of really anyone. We need to find ways to try to engage even some of those countries on the other side. Again, we mentioned Iran. I think Iran has been committing a lot of resources and, in a way, suffering. One of the losses, for instance, of Hezbollah, which has been fighting heavily on the side of the regime, they lost more soldiers than they lost with their war with Israel in 2006, right now. So I think if they reach that point, that's, again, there are really no winners in such a conflict. I think that would create the regional context for going back to talk about political solution. And we continue to lobby the world, especially those countries that care about humanitarian issues, about human life, about human rights, about international law. Those countries, we will continue to appeal to them. We have no other ways. I mean, these are the tools available to us in today's world. I think what's different from the 70s and 80s today, if you have anything happening, it's transmitted simultaneously to the rest of the world. So people today feel what's happening in Syria. I think they do, and there is some will, and that will is growing. I see it at the UN among the community of democracies, that they really want to put an end to the suffering of Syrians. Again, that could be shortened tremendously with an involvement of this country and this administration. That's why we are in Washington. That's why we are appealing to the administration, to Congress, to the public opinion think tank, to the American people to do the right thing. So,
and I say, inshallah.
Thank you.
That is from your mouth, so to speak, to the Almighty.
Thank you.
So we are going to turn to you for some. Please ask questions. Avoid commentary for now, but you're welcome to do so as long as it is very short. I'd like to entertain as many questions as possible. Just raise your hand, and you wait for a mic to come to you, and then ask your question. So raise your hand, and so I can recognize. If you don't raise your hand quickly, we're going to continue with our conversation. Usually we see 10 hands quickly. Please, this gentleman there.
Good evening. What can the opposition forces do to demonstrate to the world that they have their priorities in place and that they have the commitment in place to follow through, whether it's consolidating their current holdings and expanding them as they can to move this away from a zero-sum game? And what can they do to improve their public relations to the world, because it's almost a non-news event anymore. It needs to be spoken of much more often, much more aggressively.
Should we address each question?
Yes, please.
I think it's really a good question, and we do take that very seriously. We always believe that we have to improve our internal house, if you will, both politically and militarily. Recently, I would mention at the level of the Free Syrian Army, there was an attempt to restructure the Supreme Military Command to bring more army officers who are professional to be in charge, to bring more unity to the various groups on the ground. There was a counter-offense carried out, for instance, in the coastal area, It's true that there were some extremist elements that took part in that, but they were really small, very small. Again, it was a demonstration that we are continuing this. As I said, the so-called advances by the regime are not, so substantial that they totally destroying the other side. The regime cannot maintain control over areas. That's true, by the way, of the Free Syrian Army, because sometimes, we lost some towns on the mountain between Syria and Lebanon, the Qalamun, simply because in some cases the Free Syrian Army ran out of ammunition. They believe sometimes it's better to evacuate cities so you don't bring retaliation from the regime and you could carry out guerrilla warfare. There are so many, again, ways to do that. So we're trying to improve the command and structure. We try to improve the training. We're trying to get, if we get them the right armament. I think all of those things. For instance, there was just a pilot program of providing anti-tank to the Free Syrian Army, to one specific unit which is very trusted. And it made a huge psychological impact on the other fighters. The offense in the coastal area gave some support to those who are fighting elsewhere. There are fights that's taking place in almost every town and city in Syria. So the situation is not so grim. The situation is not so, but in order to really have a fair fight, if you will, we're asking the international community, our friends, to provide us with strategic weaponry, especially the anti-aircraft, because that's where the regime is using its superiority to punish, more than really to take over areas. What's happening, the barrel bombing campaign, it's just unbelievable. And escalated with Geneva. Again, their way of saying we believe in a political solution. People in Syria became so cynical they were calling those the Geneva, bombs or barrels. I think, again, we need to continue to improve our unity, to improve our, to clearly take position. And I think that was demonstrated against the extremists as well as the regime. So that would give confidence in our friends and in the international community. And to continue to do what you suggested, in fact, in terms of the PR. Not only here, but everywhere. And I think we, in this country, we need to do so, especially to really address the public opinion, to address Americans. We're doing, the best we can, but we are so limited in our resources. So again, if you have specific suggestions.
Well, we'll take other questions. Anyone else? Lady there next to you. That's right.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the jihadists in Syria, because I personally think that it's what's causing the worst PR image abroad. I've come from France, and the recent news I've heard about Syria is the hostage being freed by jihadists, the young French citizens leaving to Syria to do the jihad over there. And so I'm convinced that it's the main reason why maybe the West is so hesitant. So I was wondering what you think the Free Syrian Army could do to really dissociate themselves in the eyes of the world with this side of the opposition.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the jihadists coming to Syria added to the excuses of country is not doing enough for the Syrian people. But let me distinguish between two extremist groups. There is a group called the ISIS. The ISIS, in our mind, is a very suspicious organization from its inception. A lot of leaders of this organization were actually trained by the Syrian regime to go kill Americans in Iraq during that fight. Some of them came back and they were imprisoned and they were released from prison. And it was very, very kind of suspicious that those individuals who were basically Al-Qaeda were released while peaceful activists were kept in prison. Again, I don't want to suggest that the regime created this whole phenomenon, but a lot of those jihadists are really motivated by their feeling. They watch the news, they watch Al Jazeera, and they see the crimes committed by the regime and the lack of action by the international community, and they feel this is a just cause, and they come to join their fellow Muslims in defending this evil dictator. We, from our point of view, we don't want fighters. We don't lack fighters, in fact. And many of them who come from with extremist ideologies, they were organized by, again, the leaders who are, we very much suspect that, in fact, they might be sometimes coordinating with the Syrian regime. By the way, the ISIS, for instance, in one town, Al-Raqqa, which they controlled most of it, they were never attacked by the regime. Never. Everybody knows their headquarters. The regime attacks everywhere except that headquarters because they serve the regime. So from our point of view, we have a dual enemy. We have the regime and we have the extremists. And finally, Free Syrian Army and local population turn against the ISIS. And I think that started to change the image. So as you suggested, we need to be clear. We don't subscribe to that vision. We don't want these people to come to our country. In fact, now the largest international presence is fighting on the side of the regime. It's the Hezbollah. It's the Iraqi Shiite groups. It's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Those are in the tens of thousands. At the same time, we want all of the countries, including countries in the region, to work with us to curb that phenomena, because these people are coming through certain borders that can, in fact, be controlled. They are sometimes receiving funds from individuals within countries which are supporting us. We need, again, help to do that. But the best way to really weaken these groups is to support the moderates. Al-Nusra, which is the second group, at one point, in fact, became popular because it was able to provide food and salaries and weapons to young Syrians who couldn't find it with the moderates. So we believe we could bring back a lot of those elements to the ranks of the moderate, the mainstream Free Syrian Army. So support the moderate. We need to work with other countries. We need to distance ourselves, as you suggested. We need to commit ourselves to respecting Geneva Convention, international humanitarian laws, and we've been doing a lot of that with the moderates in order to make sure that the vision we are, in fact, fighting for is not the vision that some of these fighters come to try to create in future Syria.
When you mention ISIS, and I want to repeat, that's the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
Yes.
So they really don't, and they're not just fighting, they're fighting to create an Islamic state that is united state between Syria and Iraq. So unlike any other rebels, they have their own specific agenda. So it is not, at this juncture, they are absolutely fighting against Assad, and they're fighting against the rebels.
But more against the rebel. I mean,
this is true, more against the rebel, but they're fighting all sides because that's what they want to create, a new Islamic state, united, between Syria and Iraq. Anyway, we'll take a question. Yes, here.
Looking toward the political solution, how viable is partition as part of that?
If there is an agreement between the government delegation and the opposition in Geneva was to continue to say we are committed for the territorial integrity of Syria. So I don't think that's something, at least either side is advocating. But there were some report that if Assad were to lose, he might try to retreat to the coastal area where he has a certain base of support. But even there, I don't really think that he can create a viable state, mini-state. I think historically, I don't know if you know, that Syria during the French mandate was divided into mini-states, and none of those mini-states were viable. So it could be an outcome of maybe the conflict if it goes on longer. It can be a de facto division, but I think most of us, those who are looking for, have political vision, we want to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria, and what we want to do is, at least from our side, in the coalition, is to find a partnership with the other side, without Assad. Several times you raised the question, with Assad or without Assad. For us, the sooner Assad is removed from the scene, the sooner we can find a political solution with those who are supportive of Assad. That's why we think of a term in terms of a small, short blacklist of those who committed crimes against humanity. We are not seeking revenge or retribution at a large scale. We've learned, for instance, from the example of Iraq. The whole de-Baathification was, I think, a mistaken policy in Iraq. So we do take a long-term vision into addressing a lot of the problems of Syria. And again, we believe that we should work to maintain the unity of the country.
But given what you just said, you don't want to have revenge, retribution. But think in those terms, most of the Sunnis and other groups today blame the Alawite for what's happening. Do you really think that in the name of national unity that you're going to eliminate revenge and retribution when so many people have died, so many millions have been displaced? Are they just going to have sort of reconciliation? I mean, you need a sort of a Mandela to come and say, let's just truth and reconciliation. We'll have to leave what happened before, and we're going to have to look for the future. You don't have a Nelson Mandela to come into the fore and try and do something of the sort. How do you expect this revenge retribution, which is, I don't want to say, it's a cultural to some extent. I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not condemning it or praising it, but it is a part of the culture. You kill my brother, I'm going to kill yours.
I disagree with that last point. Despite the fact that we don't have a Mandela, but I think we all are aware of the Mandela's lesson. And we are aware of the fact that if we want to build a new country, we would have to include all communities.
I agree then.
I think one positive maybe indicator so far, even though Assad has tried to provoke again some kind of a sectarian conflict, it hasn't really worked to that extent. If you see, for instance, today, the Free Syrian Army has the capability to attack pro-regime areas because they are pro-regime areas, like Alawite areas. They have not done so. And I think this is not to say there haven't been individual cases, but we haven't seen mass scale of killing based on just, because you're Alawite or because I'm Sunni. I think that's been really, really encouraging. Second, we presented a whole, program, you mentioned the day after, of a transitional justice that we need to apply in order to prevent that possibility. And I think we do have Alawite with us in the coalition. It's not substantial, number of who are in fact, there are still a lot of fear within the Alawite community, and Assad is playing on that. But you don't find that, again, many Sunnis blame Alawites because they're Alawites. They are blamed because of they're with the regime, and with the regime there are Sunnis and others, who are fighting on the side of the regime. Thirdly, we think in practical terms. Post-conflict, I think we should explore all ways to prevent the possibilities of that, including, if needed, peacekeeping forces. So for a while, I think we should, in fact, do everything we can to prevent true civil war from becoming a sectarian war. I think the sad thing, what's happening actually now with the coming of Hezbollah and the coming of the Shiite Iraqi fighters, etc., it's becoming more like a Shia-Sunni, kind of really sectarian conflict, more than an Alawite Sunni, which is really interesting. But again, I think we need to continue to appeal to the Assad base that only those who committed crimes against humanity should be held accountable. There should be justice. Then we could have national reconciliation.
Okay, we'll take other questions. Anyone? No other questions?
We answer all your questions? That's
Well, it looks like we resolved the conflict at this point.
No, but at least we have a question there. Our friend, I think Raymond, has a question.
I'm sorry?
Raymond, I think, has a question.
Yes, please,
Thank
Raymond,
you.
yes.
Sure.
I was waiting for you.
Thanks, Professor. A question about perhaps the day after. I come from Lebanon, and from our experience in the civil war, especially the refugee issue and the displaced issue, there are still towns where the original residents have not gone back, be it because there were no reparations, or because different communities live there and they don't want to live together anymore. How do you see that playing out? Because the scale of the displacement in Syria is huge. How do you see that playing out in the day after, possibly?
I think this is the most really tragic aspect of the Syrian conflict, displacement and refugees. I mean, But if you look at the demographics of Syria, and I think this is different from Lebanon, where you had in Lebanon, you know, half of the population Christians of different denomination, half Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis, others. The overwhelming majority of those who were forced out of their homes are Sunnis because of the demographics, because the Sunnis are the majority in Syria. And in fact, there are still a large number of loyalists to the regime have not been affected to large extent. So I don't think there will be a problem for a lot of these communities to go back to their original towns and communities, except you need to just make sure there is security. I mean, that's been the problem why people haven't really been back. That's why, again, if you neutralize the air force of the regime, believe me, a lot of people, at least on the Turkish border, were forced out of the northwest of the north, would be able to easily come back. They don't have problems with other communities, like the case was in Lebanon, you know, where Lebanon was so mixed. I mean, so some neighborhoods, some towns, some areas where, you know, there was a fear if they go back. Maybe with the exception of one city, which is Homs. I think it's where the majority of the population of Homs are forced out of their homes. But the majority are still Sunnis, and there are some Alawite neighborhood now. But for the rest of the country, they can go back once the conditions, again, of the continued violence stopped, the killing, basically, the bombardment, the shelling. But in some of those contested areas, again, you know, the fault line areas, yes, we need to find ways to convince people to coexist and live together. Sure.
Because you
Please.
touched on the wider issue of reconciliation. Maybe that should have been my question. How do you do that in the future? I mean, these are, you know, I'm sure, you know, now in some areas or in most areas, you know, Sunnis and Alawites are sworn enemies, or even the Christian, you know, communities are affected because they, you know, they're not siding against the regime. The Kurds are affected as well. So, you know, that's the wider issue, I guess. And how do you reconcile those communities?
I think the most difficult, maybe, aspect of this is going to be the Sunni Alawite. And we've studied actually different models of national reconciliation, you know, and we're not the first one to face this issue. There are certain, in fact, efforts at local level. There are certain efforts with religious leaders that can, in fact, do some educating their communities about that. But I really believe that one, practically, as a political scientist, I believe in creating structures that people believe that can be assuring for their safety in the future, for their well-being, for the fact that they would have equal opportunity, and creating that alternative structure. I think if they see themselves part of the future of Syria, that you're not excluding them. If we look, for instance, at Iraq, I think one of the weaknesses of building new democratic Iraq was the perception of many Sunnis that they were punished, in fact, as a community. So I think we are conscious of all of those examples, and so we try to avoid some of those mistakes. As I said, for instance, if you listen to the discourse of the coalition and the mainstream opposition, we never speak in a sectarian language. We have strong representation of Kurdish, Turkoman, Druze, Christian, and Alawite representation in the coalition. So it's not a Sunni versus, you know, the rest. I think that's continuing to stick to that kind of model of coexisting and living together. I mean, we have no other choice. This is a country, these are the people of Syria. And I think, again, by saying that only those who were engaged in atrocities from all sides should be held accountable, I think, you know, and offering some justice to those victims of the millions who, in fact, are affected, then you are able to find, you know, specific models of national reconciliation. And it's going to take a long time. I don't want to, you know, make it sound easy. But at least we've thought about some of those issues. We studied other examples. We are committed to national reconciliation. And but the more immediate challenge is to end the killing now.
So just finally, you know, what is your hope, say, for the next few months? What would you hope to see?
What I hope to see is, finding an immediate solution to humanitarian access, because now we have 3.5 million really require immediate assistance from the international community. There are a lot of efforts to do that at the level of the UN, other countries, so we need to find immediate solution to that. Second, we would like to find an end to this killing, especially by barrel bombing. So we will continue to work to demand our rights to, find solution to that. Again, maybe open other ideas to put those countries, friends of Syria, before their responsibilities. Provide anti-tank, anti-aircraft missiles, and so on and so forth. Simply from our point of view, to change the military balance, to convince the other side that there is no military solution. Politically, continue to lobby the international community, all of the countries, and most of them are on the right side of things, to support the political solution. And I think there are ways. And I think the Geneva communique is not a bad framework for that. Again, we would like to continue to work to convince this country in particular to take a leading role in ending the conflict and putting the country on a path of a transition, political, democratic transition.
Well, just the right time. Thank you so much for your wonderful conclusion. And thank you here, everyone, for being here with us today. I just want to remind you, we have a wonderful reception upstairs. You can drink all the wine and all the food you wish. It's upstairs, so we'll see you up there. Thank you again for being here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For taking the time. Very grateful to you. Thank you.